Did anyone truly live to be old in the Middle Ages, from roughly 500 to 1500 AD? What did their lives really look like, beyond the stereotypes of hardship and early death? Number 10. The lifelong learner. Old age and continued education in monasteries and beyond. Many people think of medieval life as a constant struggle with little time for anything beyond survival. This idea sometimes makes us overlook the rich intellectual lives some individuals maintained well into their later years. For a significant portion of the medieval population, old age was not a period of intellectual decline or withdrawal, but often a time of deepened study and contemplation, especially within religious institutions, monasteries, convents, and even some noble households served as havens where older individuals, both men and women, could dedicate themselves to learning, scripture, and scholarship. An older monk or nun, having spent decades in a religious order, would possess a vast knowledge of scripture, theology, and the history of their institution. They might have been scribes, painstakingly copying manuscripts by hand, a task requiring immense patience and sharp eyesight, skills that were often preserved well into old age. Such individuals were not merely passive recipients of knowledge, but active contributors. They often became teachers, guiding younger novices through complex texts and monastic traditions. Their experience was invaluable. The writings of figures like Bede, for example, show a scholar who remained active and learned well into his later years, contributing significantly to history and theology until his death. In 735 AD, even as his physical strength might have waned, his mental faculties remained sharp, and his commitment to learning never diminished. For lay people, the opportunities for formal education might have been less widespread, but a different kind of lifelong learning still occurred. Older members of a community, particularly those with specialized skills or knowledge, would serve as informal educators. A village elder, perhaps a retired master builder, might pass on knowledge of construction techniques to an apprentice. An older woman, steeped in generations of herbal lore, would teach younger women about medicinal plants and remedies. These were not formal schools in the modern sense, but they were vital channels for transmitting accumulated wisdom. The ability to recall stories, historical events, or the lineage of local families was highly valued. Older individuals often held the collective memory of the community, serving as living archives of local custom and precedent. In cathedral schools and nascent universities, older scholars continued their work, debating theological points, transposing new commentaries. Figures like Albertus Magnus, who lived into his 80s, continued to write and teach, producing monumental works on philosophy and natural science. His later years were marked by a continuing intellectual vigor that challenged the idea of old age as a period of intellectual stagnation. For those with access to books which were precious and rare, old age could be a time of profound personal study. A wealthy merchant or a landed knight, having fulfilled their active duties, might retreat to their library, if they possessed one, to delve into chronicles, religious texts, or even works of courtly literature. This private pursuit of knowledge, while less visible than monastic scholarship, was still a form of lifelong learning. The concept of contemplation and preparation for the afterlife also fueled intellectual pursuits in old age. Many individuals, as they approached their final years, would spend more time in prayer, meditation, and reading religious texts. This was not just about spiritual devotion, but also about intellectual engagement with profound theological questions. The act of reading and reflecting on Scripture was considered a virtuous and enriching activity, one that did not diminish with age, but often deepened. It was a time when the concerns of the material world could begin to recede, allowing for a greater focus on spiritual and intellectual growth. The libraries of monasteries and private collections held not just religious texts, but also works on history, philosophy, and practical arts. Older individuals with fewer pressing daily obligations might have the leisure to explore these vast resources. The image of the wise elder poring over ancient texts was not just a literary trope, but a reflection of a real aspect of medieval life for those who had the means and opportunity. Number 9. The senior artisan. Skill, craft, and economic contribution in later life. The medieval economy, far from being static, relied heavily on skilled craftspeople. Many people assumed that old age meant an automatic retirement from work, a fading into the background. However, for many medieval artisans, old age was not a time of unemployment or dependence, but often a period when their accumulated skill and experience were at their peak. A master craftsman, whether a weaver, a carpenter, a blacksmith, or a goldsmith, built his reputation over decades. His hands might have become gnarled and his eyesight a bit dimmer, but his judgment, his knowledge of materials, and his command of complex techniques were irreplaceable. Consider a master weaver in a thriving textile town. He would have learned his trade as a boy, starting with simple tasks and gradually progressing to more intricate patterns and specialized fabrics. By the time he reached his 50s or 60s, he would possess an intimate understanding of different wools, dyes, and loom mechanisms. He would know the precise tension needed for a fine piece of cloth, the subtle variations in color, and the most efficient way to repair a broken thread. Younger apprentices and journeymen might be faster, but they lacked the master's touch, his accumulated wisdom. This master might no longer operate the loom for long hours himself, but he would oversee the workshop, design new patterns, purchase raw materials, and negotiate with merchants. His name on the finished product was a mark of quality. He might also be responsible for training the next generation, passing on not just techniques, but also the unwritten rules of the trade. A master mason responsible for constructing a cathedral or a castle would be an expert in stone selection, structural integrity, and the intricate geometry of arches and vaults. His later years would see him perhaps less involved in the heavy lifting of stones, but more in the planning, supervision, and artistic direction of projects. He would be the one consulted when a difficult engineering problem arose, or when a new design element was needed. His knowledge of the local stone quarries, the reliability of his workforce, and his understanding of historical precedents would be invaluable. The economic contribution of such an individual was not just in the value of their labor, but in the intellectual capital they brought to a project. Guilds, which organized trades in medieval towns, often recognized and protected the status of their older masters. They might have provisions for masters who could no longer work full-time, but this was more about honoring their past contributions and ensuring their dignity than dismissing them from the workforce. Often, these older masters held leadership positions within the guild, setting standards, resolving disputes, and representing the guild's interests. Even for simpler trades, like that of a baker or a shoemaker, experience mattered. An old baker knew how to adjust his recipes for different flours, how to manage the heat of his oven, and how to gauge the exact proofing time for perfect bread, even on a cold, damp morning. A seasoned shoemaker understood the individual needs of his customers' feet, the best leather for different conditions, and the repairs that would make a worn shoe last just a bit longer. These were not skills learned overnight. They were honed over a lifetime of practice and observation. The trust that customers placed in an older artisan's work often translated into steady business, even if they worked at a slower pace. The concept of a retirement age as we know it today was not common. People worked as long as they were able, and their work adapted to their physical capabilities. An older artisan might transition from physically demanding tasks to more supervisory, advisory, or specialized roles. A goldsmith, for example, might stop hammering large pieces of metal, but continue to do intricate filigree work or set precious stones, tasks requiring steady hands and keen eyesight rather than brute strength. Their economic contribution did not cease. It simply changed form. Their accumulated capital, whether in tools, materials, or reputation, ensured their continued relevance in the medieval economy. They were not just consumers, they were active producers, even in their twilight years, sustaining the economic vitality of their communities. The prestige associated with a master craftsman meant that even in old age their standing in society remained high, reflecting their continued economic and social utility. Number 8. The judicial elder. Wisdom, arbitration, and legal influence. When we think of medieval justice, images of trials by ordeal or harsh feudal lords might come to mind. What often goes unremarked is the significant role played by older individuals in the daily administration of justice and the resolution of disputes within communities. These were not necessarily formally appointed judges in the modern sense, but respected elders whose wisdom and long experience made them natural arbiters and sources of legal precedent. Their influence was less about written law and more about custom, tradition, and community consensus. In a village, disputes might arise over land boundaries, livestock, or family squabbles. Instead of immediately appealing to a distant lord's court, villagers often turned to their older neighbors. An elder, having lived in the community for decades, would have witnessed numerous similar disputes, remembered past resolutions, and understood the intricate relationships between families. They knew the history of the land, the precedents set by previous generations, and the unwritten rules that governed local life. Their judgments were often rooted in common sense and a deep understanding of local custom. They acted as mediators, seeking to reconcile parties and restore harmony rather than simply imposing a verdict. Their authority came from respect, not from formal appointment. Manorial courts, which handled many local legal matters, also relied on the wisdom of older members of the community. These courts were often presided over by the Lord Steward, but the actual decision-making body, the jury, was composed of local men. Often, older, respected figures within the community were chosen for these juries. Their memory of past cases, their knowledge of local land tenure, and their understanding of the characters involved were crucial in reaching a fair decision. They were the living embodiment of local legal tradition. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, often records the testimony of older local men regarding land ownership and customary rights, highlighting their role as living legal archives. Their evidence was considered particularly weighty because of their long memory and perceived impartiality. Even at higher levels of legal administration, older individuals played a role. Bishops, abbots, and other high-ranking church officials, often advanced in years, served as judges in ecclesiastical courts, which handled matters like marriage, wills, and moral offenses. Their extensive theological knowledge and understanding of canon law, accumulated over a lifetime, made them formidable legal authorities. Similarly, older nobles, experienced in the intricate web of feudal obligations and land tenure, might serve on royal councils or act as royal justices, bringing their practical understanding of govern and theories. The act of witnessing a legal document was also significant. Older individuals were often sought out to witness charters, land transfers, and marriage agreements. Their long life meant they were likely to remember the transaction, and their reputation added weight and legitimacy to the document. Their presence ensured a form of social accountability, making it harder for parties to later dispute the terms of an agreement. This practice shows a deep-seated trust in the memory and integrity of the aged. Their testimony in a court, whether formal or informal, could often sway a decision due to their perceived honesty and long-term observation of community norms. They were seen as less likely to be swayed by short-term gain or personal animosity, embodying a certain objective wisdom. This judicial influence of older individuals was not based on written laws that everyone could access, but on a communal oral tradition. Justice was often about restoring balance and upholding community standards, and the older generation was seen as the guardian of these standards. Their ability to arbitrate disputes, to recall precedents, and to command respect within the community made them indispensable to the functioning of medieval justice. They were not just passive recipients of care in their old age, they were active participants in maintaining social order and upholding the rule of custom. Their legal influence highlights how vital their experience and long memory were to the stable functioning of medieval society. Number 7. The gifting hand. Testamentary practices and the power of bequests. When medieval people grew old, they began to seriously think about their legacy, especially how their wealth and possessions would be distributed after their death. This was not just a practical matter of inheritance, but a powerful way for older individuals to exert influence, secure their future care, and shape the spiritual landscape of their community. The act of making a will or a testament was a significant event, often done in old age or when facing a serious illness. And it shows the continued agency of the elderly. People typically did not have much in the way of savings accounts or modern retirement plans. Their wealth was often tied up in land, livestock, tools, household goods, or sometimes coin. As they aged, particularly if they no longer had children to directly inherit, or if they desired a specific spiritual benefit, they might make arrangements to exchange property for care in their final years. This could take the form of a pre-mortem bequest where an older person transferred land or goods to a family member or a religious institution in exchange for lifelong support, including food, lodging, and sometimes even burial arrangements. These agreements, sometimes written down, sometimes verbal and witnessed, provided a degree of security for the elderly and showed their ability to leverage their assets, even when they were no longer able to work the land or manage their affairs actively. Bequests were not just about practicalities. People believed that good works, including charitable donations made in their will, could help secure their place in heaven. Older individuals, acutely aware of their approaching mortality, often designated significant portions of their wealth to the church, to monasteries, or to specific charitable causes. They might leave money for masses to be said for their soul, for the poor of their parish, or for the upkeep of a local chapel. For example, a wealthy merchant might leave funds for the construction of an altar, ensuring his name was associated with a permanent act of piety. A widow might leave her best dress or a piece of jewelry to a convent in exchange for prayers. These acts were a profound demonstration of their continued spiritual and social agency. The contents of medieval wills offer a fascinating glimpse into the lives and priorities of the elderly. They meticulously listed household items, clothing, tools, books, and sometimes even individual animals, revealing not just their possessions, but also their personal attachments. A will might specify which child inherited a particular piece of furniture or which grandchild received a favorite book. This level of detail shows the elderly person's desire to maintain control and order, even as they prepared for death. They were not simply passive recipients of care, but active managers of their legacy. Disputes over wills were not uncommon, highlighting the value and importance placed on these testamentary documents. Furthermore, wills were not just for the very rich. Even peasants and urban laborers, if they had any personal property beyond the clothes on their backs, might make a simple verbal will witnessed by neighbors about who should receive their few tools or their humble dwelling. This was about asserting their dignity and ensuring their wishes were respected after they were gone. The ability to make a will to distribute one's earthly possessions was a recognition of an individual's legal standing and a fundamental expression of personal autonomy in old age. It allowed them to extend their influence beyond their lifespan, providing for their family, benefiting their community, and caring for their soul. The process of preparing a will involved discussions with family, clergy, and sometimes legal experts, highlighting the social engagement and importance of older individuals in structuring the future. This gifting hand was a powerful tool, shaping both earthly and spiritual destinies. Number 6. The caregiver's burden and blessing. Intergenerational care dynamics. When thinking about old age in the Middle Ages, many might imagine that elderly people were simply left to fend for themselves or quickly died. However, the reality for most medieval people was a complex interplay of family obligations and community support. Particularly in terms of care, intergenerational care was not just a common practice. It was a fundamental aspect of social life, presenting both challenges and profound benefits for all involved. The vast majority of people lived in multi-generational households where grandparents, parents, and children shared the same living space, whether a peasant's cottage, an urban dwelling, or a lord's manor. This arrangement meant that the care of older family members was a daily reality woven into the fabric of household life. As individuals aged, their physical capabilities might decline, making tasks like strenuous farm labor or heavy lifting difficult. Younger family members, typically their adult children and grandchildren, would step in to take over these more demanding tasks. This was not always a formal arrangement, but a natural progression of responsibilities within the family unit. An older woman no longer able to churn butter or weave cloth for hours might take on lighter duties like mending clothes, tending to children, or preparing simpler meals. An older man might supervise younger family members in the fields, offering advice based on decades of experience. Even if he could no longer wield a plow himself, the care provided was often very practical. It included preparing soft foods for those with failing teeth, providing warmth in cold winters, and assisting with personal hygiene. When illness struck, which was frequent, younger family members would nurse the sick using traditional remedies and offering comfort. There were no hospitals in the modern sense. For the general population, care almost exclusively happened within the home. This domestic caregiving was a continuous and often demanding effort, especially when an older person became frail or bedridden. It could indeed be a burden, particularly for poorer families with limited resources, adding strain to already precarious livelihoods. The balance between the productive capacity of the household and the needs of its non-productive members was a constant negotiation. However, the presence of older family members was also seen as a significant blessing. They brought wisdom, experience, and the continuity of tradition to the household. Grandparents were often primary caregivers for young children, freeing parents to work in the fields or engage in crafts. They passed down stories, skills, and religious knowledge, shaping the next generation's understanding of their world. A grandmother might teach her granddaughter about herbal medicine, while a grandfather might instruct his grandson in carpentry or farming techniques. Their presence also provided a stable emotional anchor, offering comfort and guidance. This exchange of services, practical care from the young, wisdom and child care from the old, created a reciprocal system of support. Religious teachings also reinforced the duty to care for the elderly. Christian doctrine emphasized filial piety and charity, urging children to honor their parents and care for those in need. For those without family or whose families could not support them, charitable institutions like almshouses or monastic infirmaries offered some limited care, though these were relatively few and often reserved for specific groups. More commonly, the community as a whole would offer support. Neighbors might share food or provide assistance if an older person was alone. This was particularly true in tightly knit rural communities where everyone relied on each other. The bond between generations was not just a social norm, but a practical necessity for survival and well-being. The intergenerational household was thus a complex living ecosystem, where old age was managed not in isolation, but within the dynamic relationships of family and community. This reciprocal care, though challenging, underlined the enduring value and integration of older people within medieval society. Number 5. The age of pilgrimage. Spiritual journeys and physical endurance in later years. For many medieval people, the concept of a bucket list might seem strange, but a powerful spiritual desire often drove older individuals to undertake incredible physical feats. The pilgrimage. We might think of medieval life as sedentary and old age as a time of slowing down, but for many, it was a period when they felt compelled to embark on long, arduous journeys to holy sites. These pilgrimages were not just walks in the park, they were acts of profound devotion, requiring immense physical endurance and mental fortitude, often undertaken by individuals well into their later years. Why would an older person, perhaps suffering from various aches and pains, choose to walk hundreds, even thousands of miles? The motivations were deeply spiritual. Pilgrimages were undertaken to seek divine favor, to atone for sins, to pray for healing from illness, or to give thanks for blessings received. As people aged, the awareness of their mortality grew sharper, and the desire to secure salvation became more pressing. A pilgrimage was seen as a powerful act of piety, a way to demonstrate faith and earn spiritual merit. For many, it was the culmination of a lifetime of religious devotion, a final grand gesture of faith before meeting their Maker. The most famous pilgrimage destinations were Jerusalem, Rome, and Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Journeys to these places could take months or even years, often on foot, exposed to the elements, dangers from bandits, and the constant threat of illness. Pilgrims relied on the charity of strangers, staying in hospices or monasteries along the route. For an older person, this journey was even more challenging. They had to contend with weakened joints, poor eyesight, and a reduced capacity for strenuous activity. Yet accounts from the period describe older men and women undertaking these very journeys. Marjorie Kempe, a famous English mystic of the 15th century, embarked on extensive pilgrimages, including to Jerusalem and Rome, while well into her middle and later years, facing considerable hardship, but driven by intense religious fervor. Her story shows the incredible determination of older pilgrims. Pilgrimage was also a social activity. While some might travel alone, many joined groups, finding safety in numbers and companionship on the road. Older pilgrims might travel with family members or with fellow parishioners. Relying on mutual support, the shared purpose and hardship created strong bonds. For some, the journey itself, with its challenges and spiritual encounters, was as important as reaching the destination. Along the way, they would visit other holy sites, encounter diverse people, and experience different cultures, broadening their horizons in ways few others did. This was an active, purposeful engagement with the world in old age. Far from a passive retirement, upon returning, a pilgrim would be highly respected in their community. They would carry special tokens like the scallop shell for Santiago or palm fronds for Jerusalem as proof of their journey. Their stories and experiences would be shared, providing spiritual inspiration, and sometimes even a form of local celebrity. The act of completing a pilgrimage in old age was a testament to one's faith, resilience, and personal strength. It showed that despite physical limitations, the spirit remained strong and capable of immense effort. Far from being a time of quiet retreat, old age for many medieval people was a period of active spiritual quest, culminating in arduous journeys that tested their limits and reaffirmed their devotion. This commitment to spiritual adventure highlights an overlooked aspect of their dynamic engagement with life in later years. Number 4. The diet of the aged. Specific foodways and nutritional understandings. When people think about medieval food, they often imagine bland, scarce meals or lavish feasts for the rich. They might not consider that medieval people, especially those in their older years, often had specific dietary practices and understandings that reflected their awareness of aging bodies and their attempts to maintain health. While modern nutritional science was unknown, medieval individuals and their caregivers understood that food played a crucial role in well-being, especially as one aged. Medieval medical theories, largely based on the ancient Greek concept of humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, influenced dietary advice. As people aged, it was believed that their bodies became colder and drier. Therefore, older individuals were often advised to consume foods that were warm and moist to balance these perceived changes. This meant favoring rich broths, warm milk, and cooked meats that were believed to be easily digestible and nourishing. Foods considered cold or dry, like certain raw fruits or vegetables or excessive amounts of vinegar, might be avoided or consumed in moderation by the elderly. This approach was not just about comfort. It was a deliberate attempt to maintain internal balance and prevent illness. The availability of food varied greatly, depending on social class and region. For the wealthy elderly, this dietary advice, translated into access to a wider variety of foods, considered beneficial. They might consume fine wheat bread, tender cuts of meat from younger animals, and aged cheeses, alongside spiced wines believed to have warming properties. Special cooks might prepare dishes specifically for an aging lord or lady, focusing on soft textures and easily digestible ingredients. Fish, particularly freshwater varieties, were often recommended for their perceived lightness. Even herbs and spices were chosen, not just for flavor, but for their supposed medicinal qualities, with warming spices like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves frequently used. These were not just luxuries, but part of a considered health regimen. For the common people, dietary choices were more limited, but the same principles of warming and moistening foods would be applied with available resources. Older peasants might rely more heavily on porridges made from oats or barley, cooked vegetables, and legumes, all prepared as hot, soft meals. They might also receive preferential treatment within the household, being given the choicest or tenderest pieces of meat when it was available, or a larger portion of the warming broth. Milk, when accessible, was considered highly nourishing for the elderly. Bread as staple might be made softer or soaked in broth to make it easier to consume for those with dental issues. The communal nature of medieval meals meant that family members would share resources, and often the needs of the elderly would be prioritized, reflecting both respect and practical care. Beyond the humors, there was also an understanding of the need for easily chewable and digestible foods. For individuals who had lost teeth, which was common, soft foods like stews, porridges, and finely minced meats were essential. This practical consideration often dictated meal preparation for the elderly. Mead, a fermented honey drink, or watered-down ale were common beverages, and their perceived warming and nourishing qualities were also considered beneficial for older individuals. The food given to the aged was often prepared with care, not just for sustenance, but also for its supposed therapeutic effects. This attention to specific foodways highlights a nuanced understanding of aging bodies and a deliberate effort to support health through diet, showing a more sophisticated approach to older age than often assumed. It becomes how integral food was to overall well-being and how its preparation adapted to the needs of different life stages. Number 3, the fashion of fading youth. Dress codes and aesthetic preferences for the elderly. When we picture medieval fashion, we often think of vibrant colors, elaborate costumes for the nobility, or simple tunics for peasants. What is often overlooked is how dress and appearance changed with age, and how older individuals, particularly the wealthy, used clothing to signify their status, wisdom, and dignity, rather than attempting to cling to the fashions of youth. Medieval societies had subtle yet distinct aesthetic preferences for their elders, reflecting a societal value placed on gravitas and maturity. For older men, especially those of noble or wealthy status, clothing tended to become more somber, formal, and perhaps less flamboyant than that of their younger. While younger men might wear short, fashionable tunics or tight hose, older men gravitated towards longer, more flowing robes or cloaks. These garments not only offered comfort and warmth, but also conveyed a sense of gravitas and authority. The colors chosen might be darker and richer, like deep blues, greens, or purples, rather than the bright reds and yellows favored by the young. Fabrics were often of high quality, such as fine wool or velvet, emphasizing luxury and status, without being ostentatious. Fur linings were common for warmth and luxury, signifying wealth and comfort suitable for someone of their standing. The cut of the clothing was less about showing off a youthful figure and more about conveying dignity and a refined presence. Hats, often tall and formal, added to the imposing silhouette. For older women, the shift in fashion was even more pronounced, especially for married women and widows. A distinctive feature was the increasing use of head coverings, like veils or wimples, which completely covered the hair and neck. While younger women might wear simpler veils or no head covering, older women, especially widows, often wore complex arrangements of linen that framed the face, signifying modesty, piety, and a departure from the vanities of youth. These head coverings also became a symbol of their mature status and often their experience and wisdom. Colors for older women's clothing also tended towards the more subdued and dignified, such as blues, grays, and natural wool colors. Though wealthy women would still wear expensive fabrics, like silk, their gowns were often long and flowing, emphasizing comfort and modesty rather than a youthful silhouette. The emphasis shifted from attracting a mate to embodying respectability and piety. Jewelry and accessories for older individuals were also distinct, while younger nobles might wear flashy and trendy pieces. Older men and women might opt for more understated heirloom jewelry, perhaps a signet ring or a simple brooch which conveyed family history and lasting value rather than fleeting fashion. Practical accessories like sturdy shoes and warm gloves were also prioritized. The overall aesthetic for the medieval elderly was one of dignified conservatism. It was not about disguising age or attempting to appear younger, but about embracing the visual cues of maturity and wisdom. This aesthetic preference reflects a societal attitude that valued age. An older person, dressed in clothing that conveyed their wisdom and experience, was seen as a pillar of the community, not someone to be pitied or ignored. Their clothing reinforced their social standing and their perceived moral authority. It was a conscious choice to adopt a style that projected maturity and respect rather than striving for the fleeting trends of youth. The fashion of fading youth was not about fading into obscurity, but about stepping into a role of dignified authority, visually communicating a new stage of life that commanded reverence rather than youth-obsessed admiration. It shows a nuanced understanding of appearance as a marker of identity and status across the lifespan. Number 2, the home hospice. End of life, care, and dignified departures. When someone in the Middle Ages was approaching the end of their life, the concept of a modern hospital hospice was non-existent. Instead, the final moments of life were almost exclusively lived out within the home, surrounded by family, neighbors, and spiritual figures. This home-based care was deeply personal, communal, and steeped in religious ritual, aiming to provide a dignified departure for the dying individual. The focus was not on prolonging life at all costs, but on ensuring a peaceful, spiritual, and prepared transition. The care for the dying was primarily provided by family members, most often women of the household, including daughters, wives, and even daughters-in-law. They would provide comfort, clean the dying person, and offer whatever food and drink could be consumed. This intimate, continuous presence meant that the dying person was rarely alone. Neighbors and friends would also visit, offering support to both the dying and their caregivers. This communal aspect of care ensured that the individual was held within the embrace of their community until the very end. The sounds and smells of daily life continued around them, even as their own life ebbed. Spiritual preparation was paramount. As death approached, a priest would be summoned to administer the last rites: confession, extreme unction, anointing of the sick, and Holy Communion. These sacraments were believed to cleanse the soul and prepare it for its journey to the afterlife. The dying person might make a final confession, express regrets, and forgive others, ensuring their soul was in a state of grace. Family members and friends would gather around the bed, praying aloud, reading from the Bible, and offering words of comfort and encouragement. These prayers were not just for the dying, but also for the living, providing solace and a shared experience of grief and hope. The deathbed scene was often a public event, witnessed by many, reinforcing the communal nature of life and death in medieval society. The medieval understanding of death was heavily influenced by Christian theology. Death was seen not as an end, but as a transition to eternity. Therefore, the focus was on helping the dying person achieve a good death, one that was peaceful, penitent, and prepared. Relics might be brought to the bedside, or an image of Christ or the Virgin Mary placed within view to provide comfort and spiritual focus. The dying person might hold a crucifix or rosary. This profound spiritual framework meant that physical pain, while acknowledged, was often secondary to the spiritual state of the individual. The focus was on the soul's salvation. After death, the body would be prepared for burial by family members, often women with great reverence. The eyes would be closed, the body washed and dressed in simple clean linen, or sometimes a shroud. The body would then lie in state, usually in the home, sometimes for a day or two, allowing family and neighbors to pay their respects. This period of wake allowed for collective mourning and affirmed the deceased person's place within the community, even after death. The funeral procession would then take the body to the church, for a service followed by burial in the churchyard. The entire process, from the initial illness to the burial, was a carefully orchestrated ritual, demonstrating the enduring respect for the individual and the communal commitment to ensuring a dignified passage from life to death. This home hospice approach highlights the personal, spiritual, and deeply communal aspects of medieval end-of-life care, revealing a society that embraced death as an integral part of life's journey. Number 1. The fluidity of old. How age was perceived, not just numerically counted. When we think about old age today, we often immediately associate it with a specific number: 65, 70, 80. This wasn't necessarily how medieval people thought about it. The concept of old age in the Middle Ages was much more fluid, culturally defined, and often dependent on an individual's physical condition, social standing, and ability to contribute rather than simply the number of years they had lived. While some texts tried to categorize life stages, the practical application of old was far less rigid than our modern ideas. Life expectancy was indeed lower, but this doesn't mean no one lived to what we would consider old age. Many people do. The challenge is that official birth records were rare for most of the population, until later in the medieval period, making precise age calculations difficult. So, how did people know someone was old? It was often a people know someone was old. Gray hair, wrinkles, stooped posture, and a slowing gait were clear visual markers. A person who looked old was considered old, but these physical markers could appear at varying ages. A person who had lived a hard life of manual labor might look significantly older in their 40s or 50s than someone of the same chronological age who had lived a more sedentary or privileged existence. The ability to work was a key factor in defining age. If a peasant could no longer effectively work the fields, or an artisan could no longer ply their trade, they might be considered old and transition to less demanding roles, regardless of their precise numerical age. Conversely, a lord or a churchman whose work involved intellectual or supervisory duties rather than physical labor could be highly productive and considered influential well into their 60s or 70s, even if they had many of the physical signs of aging. Their status and continued mental acuity often outweighed their physical condition in defining their age in a societal sense. A powerful bishop in his 70s was certainly old in years, but not old in terms of influence or capacity. Social roles also played a part. A woman who had passed childbearing age and whose children were grown and perhaps had families of their own might be seen as having entered a new stage of life, one associated with grandmotherly wisdom regardless of whether she was 45 or 55. A man who was a respected village elder, offering counsel and arbitration, embodied old age through his accumulated experience and memory, rather than merely his years. The concept of eldership was tied to authority and wisdom, not just decline. It was a respected social category. Legal documents sometimes referred to individuals as being of advanced age or stricken in years. without specifying a number, suggesting a general recognition of a life stage rather than a precise count. When an individual was deemed too old to serve in the military or hold certain public offices, it was often based on a practical assessment of their physical capabilities and judgment, not a strict age limit. This flexibility meant that old age was a highly individualized experience. There was no universal retirement age that everyone suddenly hit. Some might be considered old earlier, due to illness or hard living, while others maintained their vitality and social relevance for much longer. The fluidity of old also meant that the transition into this life stage was gradual and often unstated. It was a continuum, not a sharp cutoff point. A person slowly transitioned from being a robust adult to an aging one, with their roles and contributions adapting along the way. This nuanced understanding of age, which valued experience and continued contribution over a simple numerical tally, demonstrates a more integrated view of the elderly within medieval society than our modern age-bracketed perspectives. It underlines that for medieval people, old was a description of a lived reality encompassing physical state, social role, and personal wisdom, not just a birth date